I have two Grindr profiles, a Shane Grindr and a Courtney Grindr. On Courtney Grindr, it's just like, want a root?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. A lot of these men are so confused and so conflicted about their sexuality. And they're like, oh, so does this make me gay? Do you like pussy? Yeah. Do you like women? Yeah. Well, then you're not gay. And they're like, oh, oh, thank God.
My guest is Shane Jenek.
I do have lots of interesting conversations with straight identifying men in my bedroom life, usually about 30 seconds after climax, when a man is not thinking about sex for that 5 minutes of their day. Because as Courtney, straight identifying men find me very attractive as Courtney, but because sexuality is in such a strict binary, a lot of these men are so confused and so conflicted about their sexuality, because if they're not straight, then they must be gay. And one of the conversations I often have that is fun to watch, it's fun to watch the wheels ticking. They're like, oh, so does this make me gay? Because in their mind, that is the worst thing they could possibly be. And I say to them, excuse my crass language, you might have to bleep it, I'm not sure.
Go ahead.
I'm like, do you like, speaking in their terms, do you like pussy? Yeah. Do you like women? Yeah. I'm like, well, then you're not gay. And they're like, oh, thank God. And I'm like, none taken. But then I'm like, but you're also not straight. And they're like, they're like, oh,
like
but as
that,
long as I'm not gay.
with the math symbols like flying around.
Very that.
What?
And so this idea of like binary sexuality, binary gender really limits and creates cages, essentially like cages made for men by men.
Yes.
But with no awareness. It's that idea of systemic structures versus individual ones. And I think people often get confused when talking about any forms of like bigotry or restriction. And they're like, well, I'm not racist or I'm not misogynistic. But it's not just whether you're saying like racial slurs or misogynistic slurs. Although I would argue that all of us, not just white men and not just white people or not just men or not just women or straight people, but everybody in our Western societies has been socialized to be racist, misogynistic, and homophobic. I think it's this idea that like all white people are racist. I think all people grow up with these ideas and these hierarchies of value placed on different skin tones, genders, sexualities, and it's impossible for us to avoid that. So I think once we sort of accept that we're all going to be socialized to be racist and misogynistic and homophobic, we can take away some of the personal feelings about that, because people are like, well, I'm not. And you're like, well, we all are. And so unpacking those ideas and why those ideas occurred, I don't think they're inherent to who we are. I think they're ideas that have been given to us. So rather than just rail against them, if we can start to perhaps look at them and unpack them and work out whether they serve us or not, we'll get ahead a little better. And I think those ones that hold men in their cages, that it's not that like the straight white man was like, well, I'm going to build a cage for myself that I can't express emotions or feelings, or I have to like cars. And it wasn't a conscious thought. And that's the idea of systemic and structural, that those limited and narrow expressions of masculinity were sort of handed down in the system. Okay,
so accepting then that we all live in a cage, and one of gender norms, but all of the things that you just outlined.
Yeah.
Earlier on, you mentioned sort of being younger and playing with femininity and shunning masculinity in some ways. And so inevitably, because of that cage, which you've just very eloquently outlined, there's inevitably going to be opposition. There's going to be bullying. There's going to be all sorts of sort of nasty stuff that goes alongside it. And I wonder if, particularly when you were younger, whether you thought, maybe I should just stop. like being this way, or did it actually the converse happen and you sort of lent into it further?
I probably thought about stopping, and I just don't think it was possible.
Yeah.
Like, I think I was irrepressibly me. I think that's why for a lot of, to use the buzzwords like patriarchy and heteronormative always do make people go like, oh. But like for people who fit that bandwidth enough, they're able to exist with a level of comfort that doesn't, cause too much shame or self-loathing. But I think that if you're sort of outside that bandwidth so much that you just will never fit into it, you have no choice but to stand out. And weirdly, that is one of my greatest gifts in a way. And I think, being attracted to people of the same sex I think that's like bisexual people who are attracted to different genders. Like guys can be attracted to women, bisexual men can be attracted to women and that can feel content. And they don't need to necessarily be attracted to guys to have some part of their sexuality fulfilled. And obviously vice versa for bisexual women and other people. And so with flamers, gay men who are, whose natural gender and presentation is more feminine, who are attracted to men, it's harder to fit into the norm with that. Like, I am attracted to people of different genders, so I think in high school I was able to get through by having crushes on girls and having girlfriends, and that did feel authentic. It didn't feel like I was pretending just to fit in. I genuinely am attracted to women, and so that was a part of my sexuality I could express. But I think my attraction for men is different to my attraction for women. I think, like, for men it's romantic and sexual, and it represents a bigger facet of my sexuality. So eventually I couldn't stay in the closet about that anymore.
And that full scope or sort of full appreciation of that probably became more apparent, or did become more apparent to you after you left school and you sort of moved.
Yeah, moved to Sydney and saw different examples. And I think as well, I wonder if sometimes some of that bullying or those negative consequences that you mentioned come from people who are playing by the rules and resent those other people for expressing themselves. The idea that may cause some insight. I remember being on the tube during the pandemic when we all had to wear masks. It was very like lockdown times, and and everyone was wearing masks on the tube except for like two. They happened to be straight white men. These two men on the tube. I remember sitting there like going like, we are all playing by the rules. We're doing what we're supposed to. I remember being filled with like a rage. Like, I'm not stupid enough to ever pick a fight with somebody because I know that I won't win. But in that moment on the tube, I had a physical rage where I wanted to go up and like, because I had the masks on, but just like on their chin.
Classic.
And I wanted to like, and like, just like physical. And I was like, oh God, like, why am I overcome by this physical like anger and aggression for somebody? And it was because we, the collective, were all playing by the rules. We were doing what we're supposed to because it was important for the greater good. And then there were these two people who just thought they're above that and thought that they didn't have to wear their masks. And that made me angry. And then I thought, I wonder if, because if we look at like the incidence of say bisexuality, bisexual people represent the largest percentage of the LGBTQ plus community, but they're the least visible. And the idea, if you look at younger people, especially Gen Y and the incidences of queer identity, it's like up in the 20s and 30% now of people identifying openly with not being exclusively heterosexual. In fact, in different studies, when different types of questions are asked, you get different results. In a YouGov study, people were asked to identify as like gay, straight, or bi, and there was like about 7%, I think, who were like gay or bi, and everybody else was heterosexual. But when you asked different questions like, do you think if the right person came along at the right time, you could be attracted to somebody of the same sex, or different questions elicited different results. And I think it was like 46% of people said that they were not exclusively heterosexual. And so then I wonder if those feelings, particularly in hypermasculine worlds like sport, where there's, I think, 2 out football players in the entire world at the moment, if actually, say, let's say 20% of those people, but potentially more, actually do feel attraction for men, and they see other people expressing that, and they're having to control their feelings because they don't think there's a place for that to exist in the world. I can see how that manifests in anger and homophobia and self-loathing as well, and a lot of shame, and that's why people don't come out. And so I think that not all homophobia comes from people feeling same-sex attracted thoughts, but I do think that probably a big percentage does come from people actually having like non-normative feelings, and attraction, and an inability to express that attraction is probably, I mean, it just not being able to express who we are authentically can lead to shame.
And do you think that's because people don't know? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the implication I'm kind of getting is that basically until you went to Sydney, you didn't really know that it was possible to be gay, or that because there wasn't an example, you didn't sort of know what it was.
Well, it's not positive. I mean, even in today's society, it's still exceptional. We're still debating the rights of queer people. Like, queer people are still tokenistically included in media. I think out of Australia, the UK and the US, the 3 sort of Western civilizations that I have lived in, the UK has it less wrong than everybody else.
There was a hint of possibly a better there, but you held that back.
I do see that, like, the way, particularly gay men and women are portrayed in UK media is a lot more positive. But I think if you go to different regions, you're still going to find young people struggling to come out, and that's because there are these ideas that are either religious-based quite often.
Yep.
I just saw Strange Loop on Monday night at the Barbican, and one of the sort of main songs, I'm going to paraphrase, but it was basically, AIDS is the punishment for being gay and you're going to hell, was sort of like one of the themes that the main character really felt was pushed on them from a very young age. And there was so many of those subtle comparisons, or not so subtle comparisons, that were shown in Strange Loop that it was a real it was, they were from a very religious sort of evangelical black family in the United States, and seeing how religion impacted their queerness was really interesting. And so it's not just that people don't know that they can be queer. I think that one of the big problems is the idea of the binary. If you're not straight, then you are gay. Another big problem is the fact that there is a huge negative stigma around the idea of being gay. Like, exampled in the straight identifying men being like, oh, thank God I'm not gay, but also you're not straight. And in fact, some of these people, like, who I have relations with, it's fascinating watching how, I mean, I do feel like I'm doing God's work quite often, empowering them with language.
Damn right.
Really enables them to understand themselves better. So again, gay, straight, if that's your only 2 options, there's going to be a lot of confusion there. If being gay is a horrible thing, inverted commas, but they're not straight, but they're not gay, empowering these people with language, which I've done by talking about different sexuality ideas like pansexuality or bisexuality, or even the get out of jail free card, I think is heteroflexible.
Nice.
Because straight men are like, oh, hetero. Oh, yeah.
I'd go for that.
Yeah, I'm hetero flexible. One of these guys, I'm trying to anonymize him.
Yeah.
One of these guys recently I was talking about heteroflexible as an idea, and he'd often message me like, oh yeah, I've been feeling really hetero lately, or like, oh, maybe I'm a bit bi. But even like having those ways of expressing his feelings and naming his feelings is a step up from the denial that he was experiencing before. And then because of that, and because there's no place for him and men like him to express their sexuality in their worlds, they go seeking sex, on the down low, on dating apps, and, Grindr. There's sort of certain corners of Grindr that these heterosexual identifying men go to meet, usually sort of like femme guys, cross-dressers, trans men, but in a fetishized, sort of unhealthy expression of their sexuality. And I will say that those corners of Grindr aren't necessarily the most enlightened or positive representations of the queer community. In fact, they may confirm everything that those guys thought about queer people and hate about queer people. And so it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because there are people who I guess are culturally straight. Like, these men are ostensibly straight. They like football and they like women and they like straight things, and they don't want to like Kylie or
everyone can like Kylie.
Everyone can like Kylie. She's universally accepted.
Yeah, 100%.
Padum. But they don't want to necessarily. They aren't culturally queer. They're just culturally straight. They do like all these masculine things, but they also like it up the butt, which is not straight. And so, creating a space for them to express those parts of themselves is something that I'm really focused on. I mean, ultimately, I think everyone gets laid more.
Yep, which can only be a good thing.
If you think of that as your sales pitch, it's like, if we can work out how to make environmental protection profitable to the people in the world with the most amount of money, then we'll solve the problem. If we can work out, and I've worked out a way that everybody can get laid more.